Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Carl Jung. Move away from Levi Strauss into Carl Jung, which I think should be a pretty fun topic because Carl Jung has to deal with dreams. So, here's the question for you. What do our dreams have to do with mythology? And can our dreams help us understand myths and myths help us understand our dreams? Carl Jung thought so. So let's talk about this guy and his ideas. There's a lot going on here. One of his biggest ideas is the idea of archetypes, which means sort of the first type, the first type of thing. Arche meaning first or the ruler, the ruling type, the leader or the first thing. And what Carl Jung means by that is a kind of pattern that recurs over and over again in mythology, but also in dreams. Okay, so who is this guy? Carl Jung was a psychiatrist and what they call a psychoanalyst. It's a kind of early school of psychology that still is pretty influential to this day, but is maybe not as based on like modern neuroscience because it's kind of happening more in the 20th century than now. This psychoanalysis was sort of based around the idea of helping people overcome their neuroses, their problems in their mind, the things that were causing them trouble, and help them to become sort of more fully capable human beings. And that's what Carl Jung thought myths and dreams could help us do. If we looked at them the right way, they could tell us what was really going on in our minds. And a big part of his idea of this was the unconscious or subconscious. And I'm going to talk more about that in a second. But basically, what we think is our minds is not the whole of our minds. There's always a lot going on in the background. Basically, Carl Jung thought that our dreams, what are they really about? They're about all this sort of material that we haven't fully digested, all these experiences we've had and ideas we've encountered. Dreams are our mind's way of making sense of all that. And it's always happening kind of in the background, even when we're going about our lives and going about our day. There are all these things that affect us and, have the capacity to make us feel good or bad, these memories and experiences that we haven't fully processed yet. And he argued that dreams help us make sense of all that, but also so do myths. Because if dreams help an individual make sense of all that kind of stuff, Carl Jung argued that myths help a whole society make sense of that kind of stuff. And basically, a dream is kind of an individual person's version of mythology. And mythology is the public dream, the big dream that we're all having, sharing all these ideas with each other. So I think Carl Jung would probably argue that stories are kind of inherently related to dreams as well, that dreams, myths, and stories are all interconnected. And one of the reasons that people like Carl Jung's idea about this is because it explains why myths are so weird. Like, there's so much weird stuff going on in mythology. We noticed this almost the very first day. We've got people biting people's private parts off and all sorts of stuff like that. So why are myths so bizarre and nonsensical? Why do they follow this weird logic that doesn't really fit with the way things actually work? Because they're following a dream logic. It's more about these associations between things. Like, you'll start thinking of a bicycle, and then you'll remember someone who taught you how to ride a bicycle or something like that, and the dream will go off in a completely different direction. That's kind of how myths work too, according to Carl Jung. So he's drawn on some pretty useful stuff there, and he thinks examining this can help us really grow as people. But I should mention that Carl Jung is connected to another psychoanalyst, another sort of early psychologist type of thinker, and that was Sigmund Freud. So let's talk about Sigmund Freud, just to establish who he is, because Carl Jung kind of started as a student of Freud's. Okay, Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is kind of notorious these days. I don't think his ideas are as popular as they used to be. They're definitely not. There's still some people who kind of follow some of them, but not to the degree that people used to. It used to be you could not go anywhere in like the study of sociology or mythology or anything without running into Freud and tripping over his ideas. And he definitely got the ball rolling. I think we would say today that he started a lot of interesting stuff, but maybe not as much of it holds up today as we would want, or maybe we don't want. I don't know. But basically, the big contribution that Freud gave to psychology that we still kind of have today is the idea of repression. Basically, we suppress emotions and feelings, and we don't really know that we're doing it because we suppress things so we don't have to think about them. We have negative experiences, we have desires that we don't want to admit to, so they get suppressed and they get put into our subconscious mind instead of our conscious mind. They become sort of part of the background. And the problem with repression is that it causes neurosis, which was Freud's word for, psychological problems, basically, sort of developmental issues, almost like diseases of the mind caused by or things kind of falling apart back there. And Freud thought that things could come out in dreams. So that's why Freud spent so much time analyzing dreams, and why he's kind of the founder of that in a lot of ways, is that he thought they were giving us clues to the problems that we were having and the secret desires that we didn't want to admit to. They were there in our dreams. And nowadays, I don't think people would agree that just because you dream about something, it means you actually want it. Like, people don't want to, show up in their underpants in the middle of class or something like that. But Freud would say they actually did. That's one thing about repression in dreams. And of course, the big thing that Freud is famous for, and maybe where people kind of side-eye him today, is the Oedipus complex. So we talked about Oedipus. He's a guy who killed his father and married his mother. And Freud argued that this was a key to a lot of stuff going on in psychology, that the Greeks had kind of hit on something important. He argued that basically on subconscious level, everybody wants to do that, or all men, basically. That was Freud's argument, that children, especially children growing up, their psychology is based around these relationships with their mothers and fathers. And so he thought that boys instinctively had a rivalry with their fathers. They wanted to fight them, they wanted to overthrow them, maybe on some deep-seated repressed level they wanted to kill them. And similarly, boys had a love for their mothers that was kind of sort of, too much, too powerful, and so it had to be suppressed. Now, like, the best version of this would be to say, okay, children are close to their mothers instinctually, and then the father comes in and is like this sort of threatening outside force that intrudes on the relationship between the mother and the child. Although he thought it flipped for girls, and girls stopped being having so much love for their mothers. But the maybe strongest version of this argument would be saying, yeah, okay, children have these sort of tensions with their parents. And of course, in mythology, we've seen a lot of rivalries between parents and children, right? So that part of it kind of makes sense. And also this adoration for their parents, because parents are, providers. Mothers provide their babies with milk, but also the parents just generally provide their children with food and shelter and things like that. You can see how that could have an influence on one's psychology. But sometimes it seems like Freud actually believed that it was literally the same as a sexual thing, that baby's desire to be with its mother was exactly the same as sexual desire, and it got all flipped around as people grew older, and then the neurosis would come from people not following through on that properly. And there were some other authors, including ones mentioned in our textbook, who thought similarly, like Otto Rank argues a lot about what he calls the family romance, which is just the drama of killing your father and marrying your mother, basically. Nowadays people think this is not true. This is seems kind of wrong to people. And this was also something that seemed kind of wrong to Jung. After a while, he decided that this was not something he really believed in, the Oedipus complex idea. But what Jung kept from this was the idea of repression. And both Freud and Jung believed in this idea of the subconscious. And repression would kind of force things into your subconscious. But Jung thought we were repressing different things. He didn't think there was really this pattern like this. And I think nowadays we have a lot more knowledge of neuroscience and child psychology, so we can do without a lot of this stuff. But if you think about the time period when Freud was living, the Victorian era, people were repressing an awful lot of things, especially about sexuality. So it's not surprising that when he first started putting it out into the open like this, that people might be repressing things. A lot of people found that idea very compelling. Okay, so what is this unconscious mind or subconscious that I'm talking about? Well, this is sort of the difference between the part of our minds that we're aware of and the part of our minds that we're not. The conscious mind thinks it's in charge. It thinks it's making all the decisions. But really, it's just getting pushed and pulled around by all the stuff that's going in our unconscious mind. And that's the part of ourselves where we absorb all these ideas and influences. Especially these days, we're processing so much information on the internet and in movies and in songs and in the people we meet. We're absorbing so much of this that we don't really even have time to process it. So it just goes straight to the unconscious. And I have this image of the iceberg here because the conscious mind is just the tip of the iceberg. The unconscious mind is the whole iceberg. And one of the interesting things about Jung is that he said not only do individual people have the unconscious, there's kind of what he called a collective unconscious. Basically, that human beings have had all these different instincts and ideas and experiences, and we live in these societies, so we're constantly interacting with each other. So this material is not unique to any one person. It's shared. It's moving back and forth. Like I said, the people that you meet and the stories that you hear, the myths that you hear, they go into your unconscious mind as well. So the collective unconscious is sort of the big dreaming nature of all humanity, which is a pretty cool concept. And this is a big thing that allows Jung to develop his idea of archetypes. Basically, he thinks there are certain patterns that recur in the collective unconscious over and over again, and certain ideas or images that we keep coming back to. Now, this might be on the level of like a whole society has its unconscious archetypes, these ideas that keep coming back. Like the Greeks seem to really keep coming back to fathers and sons, sons overthrowing their fathers. And Greeks keep coming back to clever women and powerful men, things like that. You could explore a lot of different things for one individual culture. But you could also talk about on the level of like the whole world. And the whole world has important fundamental archetypes. Jung thought a lot of them came out of sort of the needs of human civilization. Like people need to have archetypes about growing up and about becoming more mature people. And people need to have archetypes about men and women and mothers and fathers and things like that. So there's a lot of the same needs being filled. He also thought some of the needs were just kind of straight up our biology, coming out of the way human beings evolved. There's a lot of fears and goals that just happen in what he called primitive man, quote, quote, that just these things came to us very naturally. Because we want to run away from predators and we want to fall in love and find a mate, things like that. All these things come very naturally to human beings on like this deep-seated animal level. And one thing Jung emphasized, which was being criticized, but he thought the criticism was incorrect, was it's not the same archetypes every time. The archetypes change. So you might have a wise old man character in mythology, but in a fairy tale, that might be, a mysterious gremlin who appears in the forest. But in a Hindu story, it might be a meditating sage or something like that. So there's quite a lot of ability for these things to change. In fact, some people talk about folk ideas that belong to a particular culture versus the universal idea, which is sort of what's underneath those different versions. Okay, so all of this leads to Jung's method of analyzing a myth. Jung, to analyze the myth, would basically tackle the archetypes, and he would try and find out what do they mean for the psychology of the society that has them. And this is very similar to the process that he did with dreams. He would analyze the myth of a dreamer and say, what does this dream mean for the dreamer who has this dream? And in the next bit, I'm going to talk about archetypes, the specific archetypes he was thinking of on like the most macro level and how he used them to analyze dreams. And think of him as a therapist trying to figure out how to help people overcome their problems. Both Jung and Freud did a lot of their work as therapists trying to help people overcome their problems. And that's sort of the tone that he takes towards mythology. So in the next video, we're going to look at that. Okay. See you then.